Eruption 12-4 Gangs and Non-State Actors of the Eruption Zone. So, to start, let's talk about the actual sovereign entities of the Eruption Zone, the Native American nations of the Mountain West. Unfortunately, when one overlays a map of the Eruption Zone and reservations, we can see that many of the largest reservations laid squarely in Yellowstone's grasp. Thousands were killed during the initial eruption, and many more refused to flee, fearing their land would be confiscated again if they left. Entire tribes were wiped out. After the Western Revolution, some Native Americans chose to flee west to Cascadia, where they would seek asylum in the indigenous nations of the Confederation. They were generally welcomed. However, some of the smaller nations simply didn't have the space to accommodate any refugees. A poll of these refugees was taken in late 2016, asking if they ever sought to return to either their traditional homeland or the reservations in the Eruption Zone, and options seemed to be split right down the middle. Of those who wanted to remain in Cascadia, the number one reason as to why was increased economic opportunities. For those who had chosen either to remain at the reservations or later returned, very little would change. I would encourage you to read up on the reservation system in the United States, as it is equally interesting and something that those of us who value being informed citizens should be aware of. It is a subject that is far too complex for me to summarize here, but suffice to say, I don't see the U.S. being too hands-on. Some of the larger reservations that have established governments, such as the Navajo Nation, would come into conflict with the gangs and militias operating in the Eruption Zone, and as such, would be forced to take arms themselves. When California claimed Arizona and Nevada in the 90s, they continued to respect the Navajo and Hopi's independence. Cascadia fully recognized most of the larger indigenous nations in the Eruption Zone as independent nations, and set up consulates and formal diplomatic relations with them as independent entities. West of the border, as part of the Cascadian Constitution, the 14 indigenous nations have the right to provide their own police forces. They have the same authority as county sheriffs in the provinces. While they are mostly concerned with more mundane police work, they do all have special response teams, and do come into contact with both U.S.-aligned paramilitary groups and U.S. forces themselves when operating in tribal areas. We've already mentioned the Free State of Jefferson militias, right-wing U.S. loyalist militia groups. Their ideologies vary from group to group, and some are supported directly by either the American Unity Party or directly by the U.S. in some way or another. Most of their activity is centered in eastern Oregon and northern California. Tribal authorities in Cascadia have zero tolerance towards their existence, and increasingly since 2010, Californian civil defense has increased operations against them. They are small in number. Estimates of active militia are usually in the low hundreds. The Kingdom of Christ is a Christian fascist separatist group located in the border region northeast of Spokane in the Idaho Panhandle. Extremely hostile to all non-whites or non-Christians, they operate as a de facto independent nation due to the U.S.'s inability to police the border region. They frequently attack Cascadian, American, and even Canadian government infrastructure and, quote, undesirable civilians. They are also relatively small in number, no more than a few hundred active members. However, their militia arm is very well equipped and organized. They model themselves on historical fascists. Most of the militia call themselves Sturmabteilung, in reference to the brown shirts. There is a small group of core members that call themselves the Einsatzkommandos, that act as enforcers and have carried out some of the KOC's most heinous acts. The Nation of Deseret is similar to the KOC. However, they were formed by the remnants of the FLDS Church in Utah after the eruption. Not as openly hostile as the KOC, but still very insular and want nothing to do with either American or Californian authorities. The nation's official capital is Salt Lake City. However, due to the extreme devastation in the area, most members still live in southern Utah and northern Arizona. Their numbers are also hard to determine, partially due to the fact that there are many non-extremist Jack Mormons in the region who may or may not support the fundamentalist regime. Standing in opposition to the right-wing groups is the Left Coast Underground, a colloquial name for pro-Californian/Cascadian left-wing activist groups operating within the border regions. For the most part, they are loose collectives with no central organization, and most of these groups are more focused on mutual aid and political advocacy. However, there are armed groups that train for community defense that will defend themselves against either extremists or criminals. Many groups have adopted symbolism from historical left-wing movements in the U.S., such as the Weather Underground and May 19th Coalition. There is no solid evidence that they are supported by the West Coast directly, but they certainly don't mind them being there either. Related are Black Panther parties of California, Arizona, and Nevada. The well-known Black Power activist group has continued to advocate for/provide community defense and self-reliance throughout the eruption and into the birth of the California Republic. Within California itself, they've become something of a political party, and a few affiliates have run for office, although the BPP has never officially been on the ballot. However, in Arizona and Nevada, they've continued to act as community defense, again, mostly against right-wing groups. The first organized crime syndicate we will discuss are Los Chicos de Lava, the Lava Boys, often called LCL. This is a collective name for the Hispanic gangs/warlords that controlled the Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico territories after the eruption. Many were affiliated with international Latin American gangs or cartels. Originally, the name Los Chicos de Lava was a derogatory name for the gangsters that operated north of the U.S. border, but over the years they have come to wear it as a badge of honor. In the late 90s and west of the Continental Divide, there was a concerted effort by the Californian Civil Defense to subdue these gangs. Decriminalization of drugs in California, Canada, and Cascadia, plus additional aid to the Latin American countries for policing, significantly reduced organized crime's power and presence in Nevada and Arizona. They remain a powerful entity in the eastern part of the eruption zone controlled by the U.S., and their continued existence is nonsensically used as part of the justification for wanting military action against the West. While LCL is the largest group of gangs in the eruption zone, there are several other groups either currently or formerly active in the area. Historically, the Italian Mafia has had significant influence on Las Vegas, so much so that it's been called a mob town. They would lose much of the power they had amassed during the eruption when most of Vegas was destroyed during the disaster. They did not disappear entirely, however, and were known to operate various small-time rackets in the area until the 90s, when civil defense moved in. Several street gangs from California also attempted to set up shop in Arizona during the early 90s. However, they too would be largely stifled by the Latin American gangs and civil defense. Motorcycle gangs from the U.S. would also provide escort services to truck convoys once the highways across the eruption zone were reopened. They were certainly effective at doing so, however, they also used this as a front for drug trafficking and other illicit trades. By the 2000s, the bikers would largely be replaced by professional security services and even civil defense in Californian territory. Similarly, the transcontinental railroads began introducing their own security services once the rail lines reopened. The first two were Burlington Northern and Southern Pacific railroads, as their main lines were far enough away from the epicenter that the tracks could be cleared. BN and SP were allowed to form militarized security forces to protect the trains crossing the country. They would usually ride in the locomotives with the train crews and/or armored cabooses at the end of the train while they crossed the lava fields. Eventually, when other railroads like Union Pacific, Denver and Rio Grande, and Santa Fe were able to get their tracks reopened, they would hire armed security as well. Despite the devastation of the Yellowstone eruption, there were some survivors in the eruption zone. Particularly on the outskirts of the zone, many chose to ride out the eruption in their homes and refused to evacuate. Others temporarily evacuated, but returned after the main eruption stopped in the late 80s. Other hardy individuals from the coasts attempted to move into the lava fields to settle in the relative lawlessness of the Mountain West. The individual loyalty of these people varied wildly, and some proved to be much more hostile than others. The two most noteworthy groups of so-called homesteaders, the first were American National Guardsmen, who refused to open fire on the civilians in the refugee camps after the eruption. There were about 200 of them in total, and they would resettle across the eruption zone, with a few even defecting to the West Coast. The second was a wave of digital nomads from the West Coast, who chose to leave crowded, expensive coastal cities for a more relaxed life in the Rockies. Many would settle in RV parks or tiny home communities, where there was access to communal water, power, and most importantly, internet access. Most of these communities were either in eastern Cascadia, central Idaho, or northern Montana. However, they could be found all across the eruption zone. These individuals would often have difficulty gaining legal employment or residency status due to the fact that American authorities did not recognize documents from the West Coast. They were effectively treated as illegal aliens, despite the fact that the U.S. still considered the West Coast to be its own territory and its residents to be its citizens. They also tended to be more left-wing than the other residents of these regions. Most of the members of the aforementioned leftist militias were these wandering homesteaders. They would occasionally clash with both American authorities and the right-wing groups that had come into existence in the eruption zone. So that concludes our little mini-series. I hope you found it interesting, or if you didn't, at least I hope you'll find having a reference for all these groups in one place helpful. Until next time.